The desert silence was tribute paid to its master. For 3 centuries, the wind whispered and the dunes shifted quietly, out of respect. But that silence was now broken, a tribute now stolen by interlopers. The vibrations rippled through miles of sand and stone before it awoke him. It was a rhythmic, artificial thrumming that violated the stillness of his scorched dominion. A crude, repetitive clamor and chanting of mankind, dragging Azuriok from the velvet shadows of slumber. The mighty dragon shifted, his scales grinding against the bedrock of his ruinous underground lair. Azuriok's eyes snapped open. Friction sparked along his spine as he uncoiled, the static charge arcing across his iridescent scales with a sound like that of tearing canvas. He felt the tremors of construction pressing down on the crust of his domain, desolate no more. The heavy thud of limestone blocks, the scrape of iron tools, and the frantic heartbeats of men laboring under a scorched sun. Cultists, building a temple for their false sun god, erecting a monument to a black sun on a land that belonged to the ancient blue storm. Azuriok weighed the intent of their architecture. There was a grace to their design, almost worthy of his notice. Grand halls designed to amplify the voice of a false deity, towering spires meant to pierce the heavens. Such a lofty perch would allow the overseeing of his lands most effectively. Azuriok exhaled, his breath turning the sand beneath his jaw into fulgurite glass. An insult, yes, but it was also opportunity. The blue dragon settled back into the cooling sands. He would let them complete their blasphemous work. He would let them polish the floors, hang the tapestries, and fatten the horde. And when the temple was perfect, he would show them exactly which god they had actually been building it for all along. Azuriok closed his eyes. He waited for the silence that would signal the final stone was set. When that silence finally came, the ground would then begin to sing. With a wingspan that blotted out the midday sun, the blue dragon ascended, casting a shadow that severed the heat of the desert floor. He circled the construction site, expecting the ants below to scatter in terror. They did not. Instead, a roar of arrogant challenge was raised. Azuriok saw the glinting of adamantite ballistae cranking into position, their bolts capable of piercing dragon scale. Armored knights, clad in enchanted gear, likely to resist lightning, banged their shields, screaming for the draconic beast to descend. They had come specifically for him, armed with the hubris of men who had slain lesser drakes and thought themselves gods. They were inviting a dragon's wrath, their mages weaving nets of binding magic. Azuriok paused in his flight, hovering just out of range of their bolts. "Let him come," he heard a battle mage shout. "Let the old worm dive, his lair will fund our crusade for a century." They were baiting him, of course. The open courtyards were a lure, exposed workers nothing more than worms on a hook to draw him near where their anti-air magic would be most effective. They believed the sky was his only domain, that his pride would force a frontal assault. With a lazy roll of his wings, the great blue dragon turned away, returning to the deep dunes of his lair miles away, disappearing beneath the sands. Azuriok would let them believe he was cowering in fear of their mages and dragon slayers. He would soon correct that assumption. A shadow blotted out the sun, but no clouds had gathered. High above, the sound of the great dragon's wings thundered, causing ripples in the temple's water basins. The battle mages shouted their commands, tracking the beast's descent, preparing to intercept the aerial assault. They fired their adamantine bolts and cast binding magic at the sky, but the weapons passed through the dragon as if it were smoke or phantom. The soaring dragon was a show of grand illusion, a harmless arcane trick of light and sound. Yet while their eyes were fixed on the heavens, the true threat uncoiled beneath their feet. Azuriok flexed his claws, the diamond-hard tips began slicing through the sandstone like wet clay. The mighty draconic beast surged upward directly beneath their heavy iron weapons, sending stone, sand, and earthen shrapnel tearing through the ranks of the robed priests and knocking the armored men off their feet. As the debris rained down, the ancient dragon's aura, a frightful presence, washed over the courtyard. Men who had slain lesser drakes froze, their instincts screaming in terror. The mages, disciplined and desperate, reacted. Those not in the grip of fear slammed down their staves in unison, weaving a banishment spell to cast the beast into the void. Azuriok felt the tug of the plane shift, a powerful hook directly into his soul. He sneered, the will of his legendary resistance choosing to remain and begin the slaughter. The Dragon Slayer Knights, elite warriors clad in heavy plate enchanted to ground even the fiercest lightning, scrambled to recover and counter. They formed a shield wall, their armor glowing with runes, confident they could absorb the dragon's breath. They had prepared well for the dragon's lightning storm, but not 80 tons of primal brutality. Azuriok would need not waste mana or breath on these men made of iron. He lunged with claw and fang, his movements a blur of electric blue and crimson. The dragon's jaws crushing living helmets, his claws parting steel and flesh as if it were linen. With a violent sweep of his tail, the blue dragon shattered the courtyard pillars, collapsing an inner wall, one escape route, and filling the air with a dense curtain of sand and pulverized rock. The world turned gray and opaque, blinding those scions still alive. Panic began to set in. Seeing the dragon's maw begin to glow, the remaining mages cast a hemispherical wall of force, seeking to create a shield to protect them from the dragon. However, just as the barrier began to shimmer into existence, Azuriok released a lance of pure voltage, the breath weapon energizing the sand particles now trapped within their impenetrable shield. The suspended silica superheated instantly, transforming the sand cloud into a flash kiln hotter than the sun. The dust melted mid-air, fusing into a cascading inferno of molten slag, scorching the mages and cooking the knights inside their own armor. The darkened courtyard fell silent, save for the cracking of cooled glass. Azuriok slid into the black depths of the temple, the clicking of his claws on the basalt promising a lesson not in theology, but anatomy, one that would begin with the peeling of armor and end with the crunch of bone. The silence of the temple-turned-tomb was broken by wet, ragged coughs. Near the altar, 4 Black Sun acolytes had survived. They crawled from the rubble, skin blistered, eyes wide with the psychosis of a trauma their scriptures never predicted. They looked up at the blue mountain of scales before them. They expected death. Azuriok met their gaze, his eyes glowing with the tempestuous energy of a brewing storm, but he did not strike. He inhaled the smoke rising from the burning corpse of their high priest, savoring the offering. He looked down upon the survivors with the cold appraisal of a jeweler inspecting flawed gems. The cultists had sought to worship a desert god, and now one stood before them. Azuriok slithered over the dais, his tail sweeping the stone statue of their deity from its pedestal. It fell with a pathetic crumble. In its place, the great dragon settled his massive serpentine form. He narrowed his eyes as a cruel smile curled his lip. The conquering dragon snatched the nearest acolyte in a single claw, squeezing until his ribs gave way with the horror of a wet crunch, tossing the broken body onto the burning pyre of the high priest, adding fuel to the fire. The 3 horrified survivors immediately fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the stone in supplication, offering their lives in servitude, hoping to exchange what remained of their dignity for continued breath. Azuriok regarded them with a heavy, jaded gaze. He briefly considered the prospect of thralls, hands to polish his scales and stack his coin, but the ancient worm knew the tedious reality of such an arrangement. The dragon's mind turned to the decades of sleep that awaited him. Living men require food and water, and they whimper in the night. And Azuriok knew well that to keep any man alive was to invite a thief into one's home. The slave who sweeps the floor today will try to escape with a precious gemstone tomorrow, or worse, lead a band of heroes to the lair while the master sleeps. No, their fate was sealed. They would definitely be more trouble than they were worth. Yet, to simply eat them felt pedestrian, a waste of the exquisite panic that currently gripped them, especially on a full stomach. The three cultists trembled, waiting for a command, any command, ready to become the thralls of their new god. Azuriok smiled and commanded the acolytes to rise. He then inhaled deeply and unleashed a concentrated beam of lightning into the deep drifts of sand at their feet. The particles in the air and on the ground ignited, creating a searing storm of molten rain. The men looked up, their eyes widening in realization as the liquefied glass descended upon them, a beautiful, terrible, igneous shroud encasing each where they stood, flash heating the life from their veins into airtight, transparent coffins before they could even finish their screams. The ancient blue dragon had created a gruesome collection of trophies. For gold is a cold comfort, and gems are silent. But the terror of men forever frozen in molten glass? Now that is a treasure worthy of a dragon's hoard. The short story you just heard will serve as the prologue to an upcoming full deep dive on the origins, anatomy, lore, and some homebrew of the Blue Dragon. I will have a link at the top of the show notes when available, but until then, I have over 100 lore-dedicated videos from dragons and devils to the full timeline of the Forgotten Realms, the undead, and everything in between. You can check them all out at the link in the show notes or the one above you right about now. And if you enjoy stories like these and/or the longer deep dives, then please consider supporting the work with a like, subscribe, and notify. Let's do it again real soon. Until then, take care, my friends.